Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. What a wonderful morning. Thank you, Judge Byrne, for that very, very insightful presentation that we just went through. I am Judge Ramona Gonzalez. I'm from Wisconsin, and I have the great joy of being the immediate past president of the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges. I hope you have enjoyed the conference this week. We are so thankful to you all for being here. We would like again to thank our partners in this endeavor, this virtual endeavor of ours, our conference sponsors and exhibitors. We would like to take a moment and highlight Casebook and the Family Treatment Court Training and Technical Assistance Program this morning for their support of this conference. We'll now share a brief video to let you see what they're all about. Emma?
Casebook PBC is dedicated to supporting those working towards the greater good. We develop purpose-built software to help human services workers do the right thing, no matter where they're working from. Casebook exists to help the helpers with a cloud-based solution that allows you to connect with clients and work anywhere you need. Information is seamlessly synchronized, providing immediate access to a client or provider's location or history. And it's all configurable, so you don't have to change the way you work. Workers can move between their work in the field, in the office, or at home seamlessly. And with scalable pricing and no minimum number of users, Casebook's user-friendly and mobile-ready software is accessible to any human services team. Whether you're a 5-person foster agency, a 50-person youth and family services agency, or a national nonprofit with 5,000 users, Casebook can support your mission with the same technology that powers the world's most advanced companies, adapted to meet the rigors of human services work. Casebook, the platform for human services.
Thank you. Thank you, Casebook and the Family Treatment Court Training and Technical Assistance Program. We appreciate your support and the support of all of our sponsors and exhibitors. We hope you have taken the time to visit their booths, watch their videos, and if not, I encourage you to reach out to them today via the chat and beyond with questions. We can't make this work without our sponsors, and we are very grateful for their services. Each of us has a unique challenge in the work that we do, and our sponsors and exhibitors have the tools to help us be better at the work that we do for our children and our families. Now this morning, we have a special treat, coping with stress, anxiety, and depression during and after the pandemic. I know we have all shared our fair share of stress and anxiety over the past year. And my friend, retired Judge Jeremy Fogel, is here to give us the tools we need to help us cope. Judging in cases involving juvenile presents emotional challenges under the best of circumstances, but the COVID pandemic has made these challenges particularly difficult. Judge Fogel is the first executive director of the Berkeley Judicial Institute, a center at Berkeley Law School whose mission is to build bridges between judges and academics and to promote an ethical, resilient, and independent judiciary. And I don't know about the rest of you, but being a part of the independent judiciary, especially during the time of COVID and the current political climate, has been particularly stressful and challenging. We're grateful to Judge Fogel for coming with us on this journey and helping us work together to lessen some of that stress. Judge Fogel?
Thank you.
It's yours.
Thank you very much, Judge Gonzalez, and welcome everyone. I am really honored to be with you. I'm really very pleased to be talking about this topic. I was a trial judge in both the state and the federal courts for 37 years, all in San Jose, California. The last 7 of those years, I was the director of the Federal Judicial Center in Washington, D.C., which is the agency that does education and policy research for the federal judiciary. So I got from that some national exposure and some national relationships. And this topic of judicial wellness and judicial stress is one that goes way back. It goes back actually to before I even became a judge. My legal work as a lawyer was in the mental health area. I was a mental health advocate and represented people with chronic mental illnesses, emotional disabilities, emotional problems that made it difficult for them to interact with the world and with the legal system in particular. And then much of the time that I was in the state court, I had family law assignments. So this is a familiar territory, although not for a number of years. But throughout that time, I was really interested in the emotional well-being, the emotional development of judges. And as Judge Gonzalez and I were talking about before we got started, that's an area of judicial education that's been pretty seriously neglected. People learn the law, they learn the rules of the road for the particular assignments that they have, but the judiciary itself doesn't do a lot in terms of providing the tools that allow judges to be resilient and to deal with the emotional stresses and strains of the work. And that's really what I want to talk about today. And I will say that one of the things that the pandemic has done, which I think is a positive thing, is that it's made judges around the country more aware of the need for this type of introspection. I've received so many requests to give this talk or some version of it from different judicial organizations all over the place because people are feeling it. They're working from home, they're not seeing their colleagues, they're doing things in a very different way. And that's tended to heighten a lot of the strains that the job already creates. And that in turn has led to people to reach out and say, well, what can I do to cope? So that's what I'm going to try to talk about. I'll leave some questions at the time for questions at the end, and I hope that you'll feel free to ask them. I do have a special feeling of gratitude being able to speak to this organization. Judge Leonard Edwards, who was one of the founders of the organization, was my colleague in the Superior Court in San Jose, California for many years. I'm a tremendous admirer of his, and it's just great to see the organization be as strong and to be as deep into things as it appears to be. So I'm going to put my screen up and we'll go from there. Okay, so nice modest topic. Let me just get the. So what we're dealing with, both actually before, but certainly during, and what we will be dealing with afterwards, are various types of emotional demands. Stress, anxiety, and depression are the general categories that I want to talk about. So what causes judges to be stressed? I mean, an obvious one is too many cases. That's a concern of judges in every type of court at every level. I think it's taken on a particular resonance in the pandemic because we have to work differently, because so much of the work has been done virtually. The cases that can't be done virtually have to be basically handled through a much narrower pipeline. There are fewer courtrooms available. There's fewer safe places that cases can be heard. And so it's tended to even intensify the workload. And then I think, particularly in the area of juvenile justice and family courts, that the cases themselves have so much to them. It's not just a matter of making a legal decision, but you're dealing with a whole human situation. I think you're dealing with a human situation in just about every kind of case, but they're particularly intense situations in this area. So excessive workload is one of the most obvious and common areas of judicial stress. Then when you're talking about juvenile justice, there's this whole subject, and we could spend a session on it, just talking about the traumatic impact of seeing these cases and doing these cases. Quite often the situation that's presented is one that's hard to take in. It's hard to remain emotionally distant from. You don't even want to remain emotionally distant from it. You want to find a way to be present and concerned and engaged in the human situation that's presented to you. But at the same time, you don't want to become too enmeshed in it or too embroiled in it. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. But there's one of the things that's a constant source of stress for people in the juvenile and family court area is that you see so many cases where the situations to which you're exposed are themselves traumatic or emotionally charged. And there's really no way to shield yourself from the effects of that. There's been a lot of work done on the incidence of secondary trauma, particularly among judges who work in this area on a regular basis. So you have a lot of cases coming in, a lot of stuff that's hard for one human being to see another human being go through, and you don't have a context in which it's very easy to process that. And I'm going to talk more about that shortly. So this is another source of judicial stress, and that is the constant exposure to traumatic and emotionally charged situations. Sometimes these cases can become very sensitive matters. I mean, it's unusual in a juvenile case for the case to have a lot of broader political implications, although that's not unheard of. But there certainly are lots of instances where it's very much a question of social pressure within a particular community or a particular subset of a community. And you have the magnifying, the amplifying effect of social media. And so what is in most cases a confidential proceeding or a proceeding that's not widely exposed to the public, nonetheless can be one where there's a lot of focused interest of people outside the case putting pressure on the judge who's trying to adjudicate the case. This is even more complicated now because we are, I think rightly, so much more focused on inequality, structural unfairness, implicit bias, things like that affect decision making. And so the greater focus on those things makes each of these cases even more of a fishbowl than it otherwise would be. I mean, there's the question of whether you in making a decision, you're being appropriately mindful of those other factors. And so I think this is a tremendous source of stress, and I think it's intensified over the last year because of what's been going on in our society. Judge Gonzalez mentioned the political polarization, and there's a greater focus on structural inequality, and I think that manifests itself at the granular level in some of these cases. Obviously, judges are concerned about safety and security. Virtual proceedings have mitigated that to some extent, but there's still some real serious issues about how we're able to keep judges safe and secure with so much of the exposure now happening online. It's not so much the brick and mortar, although there certainly are those situations where people have to be fearful of physical attacks. There's the possibility of cyber attacks. It's easy for people to penetrate your privacy. So that's another ongoing source of judicial stress. This is an enormously important one, and that is isolation. I've been doing a series of seminars at Vanderbilt for the last 8 years with U.S. district judges who are at the mid-career stage. They've been judges for more than 5 years, and we spent a lot of time talking with them about what the job has been like, what they've liked, what they haven't liked, what the day-to-day experience is. And one of the things that comes up repeatedly, I'd say it's probably the number one stressor for the judges in that group, is isolation. And it's not that you're physically isolated, and this is of course pre-pandemic, as much as you are mentally and emotionally isolated. It's hard to find the kind of collegial relationship where you can really get down and talk about how cases are affecting you and where you're struggling with them. And I'll talk more about that when I get to what you can do about it. But isolation is an enormous challenge, and of course the pandemic has made that worse because we are more isolated. We're simply not able to see people in the way that we were before, and that could be colleagues, it could be staff, it could be friends. But I think that's tended to heighten a phenomenon that's already been a major source of stress. And then sort of the concomitant to that is we don't get reliable feedback. That I think is just one of the great challenges of being a judge or being in any position of power, that if you're at the top of a pyramid, it's people below you on the pyramid really are not always incentivized to tell you the truth. And it's hard to find people who can really give you an honest appraisal of where you are, or whether you're thinking clearly about something. And the judiciary is a hierarchical institution. It's designed that way. And so the lack of feedback, somebody really being able to tell you, I think you just missed that one. I don't think you're thinking straight about that. I think, there's something about that case you didn't see. That kind of feedback is hard for judges to get. And I will point out, and this will be a recurring theme, in some of the related professions like clinical psychology or social work, that type of feedback is built into the professional norms. In other words, to become a clinical psychologist, you have to do a lot of casework. You have to be in casework groups where you review each other's work, and you use that review to weed out any unconscious projection you're doing or unconscious identification that you're doing. So the idea that feedback is really important as a day-to-day practice for doing the job right in some of these mental health professions, that's built into the professional norms, whereas for judges it's not. And I think that's a really tough one. This one I hear over and over again. In fact, I did a session last night with some judges, and we were talking about the effects of the pandemic on their lives and their work. And one of the judges said, I don't feel like I have anything to complain about. He was very candid, and I really appreciated his candor. And he was talking not only about being a judge, but he was also talking about being a white male in the context of inequality and attacks on women and non-white groups. But it really is kind of an interesting phenomenon, because it's hard to get at your own anxieties, your own worries, your own stresses, if you feel like it's inappropriate for you to do that because you're very privileged to be in the position that you're in. It is a privilege to be a judge, and it's important to recognize that, and it's a appropriate balance to have, when you start feeling too sorry for yourself, to say, hey, things could be way worse, and they are way worse for an awful lot of people. But if that totally shuts down your ability to look at the things that are giving you a hard time, then that's not a good thing either. So this is a source of stress. Like, how much attention should I pay to the things that are problematic for me? Most judges I know, including myself, and I have been in recovery for a number of years now, but most judges I know are perfectionists, or they have perfectionistic tendencies, that you feel that you need to do things right. You're hard on yourself when you don't. And really it's that tendency, the positive side of that tendency is that's how you got the gold stars. That's how you did well in college and in law school. And that's how you were chosen for your judicial role, because you pay attention to details and you work hard at things. So that's the positive side. And the more problematic side of that is that if you're a perfectionist, then you end up being very hard on yourself, and then that becomes a source of stress. And then this one, maybe less so for judges who choose assignments in the juvenile family court area, but I've always found it really interesting, and did some research on judicial temperament, project I'm still involved in, and the kinds of traits that people have that attract them to be judges. And a surprising number of judges um, are people who avoid emotional conflict just temperamentally. They don't like conflict. I mean, that's why they're not social workers. That's why they're not mental health professionals. They wanted something that was a little more removed. And then, of course, if you get one of these assignments where you're dealing with emotional conflict all the time, that can really grate against your disposition. Some people are fine with it. Some people are very comfortable dealing with intense emotion and emotional conflict, but a lot of people who become judges are not. And where that is the case, then that's another source of stress. So you've got quite a few things here, and I hope that you recognize at least some of them in yourself, because I think they're very common among judges across the country and really across the world. So let me talk a little bit about the different kinds of stress, because stress is not a unitary concept. Certain kinds of stress are actually fine. In fact, you couldn't survive without them. I give the example here. You're crossing the street and you see a truck running down the street out of control, and your body, you get this adrenaline surge, and you move quickly and you get out of the way. That is pro survival, and at that moment, you are stressed. You are in a very high state of stress physically, and your heart's going to race, and everything else, and that's normal. But what happens with that kind of acute stress is that after the event is over, it dissipates. So you get out of the way of the truck, and the truck is gone, and you're on the sidewalk, and you're breathing heavily, and you say, "Wow, that was scary." But after a few minutes, usually, you're done. The stress is over, and you go on and back to your baseline. So that's acute stress, and we experience that pretty much every day. Most of the time, it's quite harmless. So chronic stress, which is really what I'm talking about in this talk, is not normal. It's not something that you really want to have to deal with, because it diminishes your quality of life. It makes your life more difficult. And what happens in chronic stress, when you kind of go back to the idea of having, say, too many intense cases. So you have an intense case, and it's stressful to listen to that case for any number of reasons. And then before you have any time to kind of wind down or decompress or really kind of get yourself back to a place where you feel like you're in equilibrium, you got another case, or you've got another stressful event. And so what happens over time is that your baseline starts to edge up. If you can sort of picture it as if your baseline is a 5, and an incident of acute stress maybe gets you up to a 10, but then you go back to a 5 when you're done. What happens if you keep having stress incidents that you don't have an opportunity to process is your baseline kind of inches up from a 5 to a 6 to a 7. And pretty soon your baseline, the place that you are most of the time, is you're in a constant state of stress. And that is what happens to judges. Generally, it happens even more commonly to judges who have calendars that are particularly stressful. They have assignments where they're constantly exposed to trauma or to emotional intensity or to excessive caseloads or to political pressure, all the things I listed under stress factors. If those things are coming at you all the time and you don't have an opportunity to process them, and you aren't able to implement some strategies for self-care, what tends to happen is that your stress level rises. Your chronic stress baseline continues to rise. And that is unfortunately very common in the judiciary. There have been a couple studies, national studies done. One just came out from the ABA, and it was focused on lawyers primarily. The study was mostly about lawyers, but there was a section in it about judges, and it found that chronic stress is a serious problem for the judiciary. And then you compound that with isolation and people being afraid to ask for help or being embarrassed about asking for help. And next thing you know, you've got real problems, which I'll talk about now, of how chronic stress is starting to affect the quality of life of the judges who have it. So what are some of the things that you can see if you're affected by chronic judicial stress? You can be preoccupied with work, so you just can't really stop thinking about work. You keep grinding about your cases, you keep grinding about the decisions you have to make, and that is certainly not a healthy state of mind. It's one that, again, in small doses for short periods of time may be necessary if you've got a really hard decision to make. But if it's some place that you are all the time, that's certainly a sign that you're stressed. And paradoxically, one of the other ways that it can play out is that you're indifferent. So that what can happen is that you have so much of that going on that your survival strategies, I'm just not going to think about it at all. So I can't go there. It's too painful. There's too much. It's too complicated, and so I'm just going to check out. So that's another way that can play out. In either case, it's a sign of chronic stress. When people are chronically stressed, they aren't present. And I'm going to talk about being present, in a second too. But if you are preoccupied, if a large part of your consciousness is taken up by stress, you're not able to be there for the people in the moment emotionally. You're not able to regulate your moods. You're not able to be patient. And these are all, when you see yourself or you see somebody being that way and it's out of character, that's a sign of that chronic stress is present. Sleeplessness, insomnia, you're processing work while you're sleeping. I mean, literally, one of the principal causes of insomnia is you have too much input, and you don't get it processed during the daytime, and so it processes itself while you're sleeping, or not sleeping, as the case may be. It keeps you awake. It makes you have dreams that are make you more tired than anything else. So that's another sign of stress. Fixation on the same narratives. If you are deeply affected by something, you can't stop thinking about that particular thing. Or maybe there's a lawyer who drives you crazy and you can't stop repeating the horrible things that lawyer did, or there's a probation officer who's driving you crazy and you can't stop talking about them. Whatever the situation is, if you find that there's a sort of, it's the same complaint over and over again, or the same narrative over and over again, that's another sign of stress. This one, very relatable, I think, to most of us. If you're feeling stressed a lot of the time, one of the ways to manage it, at least in the short term, is to numb yourself. So people who are experiencing chronic stress tend to drink more, or they use other substances. It's not just alcohol, but I mean, there's ways to use substances to dull the impact of chronic stress. And so if you see somebody doing that more, that's another indicator that chronic stress is present. And then there's a whole set of physical manifestations. There's been some research that judges are among the leaders in terms of the professions, in terms of high blood pressure, hypertension. There are many causes of it, but it's not just the stress of the job, but it is a contributor, and you see more of it in the legal profession than you do in some other professions. So it's a indicator that chronic stress is having a physical outlet there, or the people, you're always tired, or your immune system is compromised and you get sick a lot. So these are all very well known and very well documented indicia of the presence of chronic stress. And then depression and anxiety. So, the sort of longer term, deeper impacts. And basically, when I'm talking about depression, I'm simply saying that you're tending to look at things through a glass darkly. You just don't have any positive sense of anything. Things seem much worse and much more hopeless than they actually are. and anxiety is simply worrying about every little thing. So, those kinds of um, longer term manifestations also result when people are chronically stressed and don't get any relief from it. And I'll say that the pandemic has uh, heightened, in terms of what we've seen in our work, more anxiety, more depression, because people are isolated, they can't get the help they need, they don't have the tools for mitigating the chronic stress that they're experiencing. And to be very frank, the last year has been really hard. There's been a lot of things environmentally. It's not just the pandemic. It's the political polarization. It's the social upheaval, the different movements that have brought people to terms with things. So it's been a very, very difficult time for the whole society and for each of us individually. So those things tend to enhance depression and anxiety. All right, so that's the unhappy part of my talk. Now I'm going to try to be positive and talk about some of the things that you can do to deal with this array of stressors, to deal with the phenomenon of chronic stress. So there's a whole theory in psychology called emotion regulation that has been pretty much confined to psychology until fairly recently. But now there's starting to be some attention paid to how emotion regulation has a role in judging. I have a collaborator, Professor Terry Maroney from Vanderbilt, who I teach this course with I was talking about earlier for mid-career judges. And her scholarly work is about the value of emotion regulation for judges. The theory is that judges encounter and experience a lot of emotions in the course of doing their work, and some of them are fine. They're emotions that are fine to share. Others are not. You can get angry at someone. You can get disgusted with somebody. You can. There's all sorts of things that, if you're sitting on the bench and hearing a case, you may not want to show openly to the parties or in the context of a judicial proceeding. Doesn't mean you're not feeling those things. Doesn't mean that those emotions aren't going through you as you hear the case and as you do your job. A lot of times, if you let them show, if you get angry at somebody, if you really show someone how outraged you are at something they've said or done, the next thing that happens is you get a complaint from the Judicial Conduct Commission in your state. And so you don't want to be doing that. But if you just pretend that you haven't felt the feeling at all, or you stuff it down and don't find some way of dealing with it, then that just becomes another chronic stressor. That just becomes another place where you're spending your entire day and your entire week and your entire professional life clenching your teeth and not showing you're upset with people. And you're not putting it anywhere. You're not dealing with it anywhere. And so that tends to become another thing that grows inside of you and causes your stress baseline to rise. So the use of emotion regulation is, how do you find a way to identify what you're feeling and then regulate it, choose a response to it that is not impossible given the situation that you're in. That means acknowledging what you're feeling. I'm angry. I'm angry at this party because they did this. It made me feel that way. So that's what I mean in the description here by describing it in granular detail. You take the time, and you maybe can't do it on the bench, but then you take it during a recess. You take some time to think about what it is you're feeling, and to describe it as in as detailed a way as you can, and then think about what's an appropriate way to deal with that. And maybe the appropriate way to deal with that is to do nothing, or maybe the appropriate way to deal with that is to think about how you might speak to that lawyer or that party in a way that's more measured and more appropriate for the judicial situation that you're in. It could even under some circumstances, if you're in control of it, if you're really thinking about it and have thought it through, you could say, counsel, when you did that, I was, at the time, it made me very angry because, and then give the explanation. So there's things like that you can do. But the important distinction here is you're not just stuffing it down. You're not pretending that you aren't feeling it. You're not denying it. You're not minimizing it. You're not rationalizing it. You're recognizing that something is triggering you. And then you're choosing with intentionality and thought to figure out what you're going to do in response to the trigger. So that's emotion regulation. And there's some really good research being done and some good resources coming out now about how judges can cope using that strategy. Another, and I know that Judge Reyes has been a national leader in this, and I really think he's done wonderful work, and I see that he's been very active in this session. Judges using stress reduction practices that are practiced around the world, and certainly not just in the professions, but by people everywhere, and have been for a long time, to manage stress. Meditation is one that I've been involved in for 25 years. It's been a truly a lifesaver for me in creating space, a way to be able to, when I do get triggered, and I certainly do, to stop and think and assess and figure out what I want to do about it. So meditation works for that. There are other stress reduction practices. Some of them are physical exercise, gratitude, singing, walking. I mean, there's a variety of them, and I don't mean to single one out, but these are things that they're practices. They're things you do much as you do physical exercise, or even something as simple as brushing your teeth every day. That it's something you build into your life so that you can manage the things that are coming at you in a more thoughtful way. So we'll talk more about that, but that's certainly an important one. Self-care. I mean, this is kind of obvious, and it's hard to do. It's easy to say it, and it's hard to do it sometimes. But just making sure you get enough sleep, making sure that you take breaks to rest, making sure that you eat well. I'm doing a program next month with a doctor whose research suggests that eating well actually has a very beneficial effect on judging. That you by monitoring your intake, you can stay in a better state of mind while you're working. There's this famous study from Israel, it's quoted all the time, of parole officers holding hearings, and the bottom line is you don't want to have your parole hearing right before lunch, because the judges are hungry and they are not going to have the same mental acuity at that point as they will after lunch. So it's indicative of how just the simple things of taking good care of your body can help you cope. This is one that sort of the older I get, the more powerful I think it is. I mentioned earlier that judges tend to be perfectionists. Judges tend to be hard on themselves. And then, it doesn't get any easier if you're dealing with cases that are really incredibly consequential for the people involved in them. Somebody's liberties at stake, or, in the case of dependency, whether somebody continues to live with their parents, or, there's so many very, very impactful decisions that judges make, particularly in the juvenile delinquency and dependency area. And so the tendency to be hard on yourself and to want to do everything perfectly is so strong. And a very powerful antidote to that is to practice gratitude and self-compassion. And again, this is kind of it almost is easy to trivialize it. It could be a matter of taking a couple minutes every day to just stop and say, what are 3 things, or who are 3 people for whom I'm grateful? And just have that be a practice. And I think that's the key to it, that it's a practice, and that part of your daily routine is taking a minute or two to identify things for which you're grateful. Uh, and self-compassion is being able to forgive yourself. You made a mistake. You did something wrong. You didn't do something as well as you might have done it. You're having second and third and fourth thoughts about what you did. And self-compassion says, you know what? I'm a imperfect human being. I always will be, always have been. And it is really the almost the AA model. My name is Jeremy, and I've been recovering from perfectionism for 25 years. And it's like each day I try to do something to remind myself that you know I'm making my best effort. I'm doing the best I can, and I'm going to make mistakes, and I can love myself anyway. I think that's part of the practice too. And again, it's a matter of iteration. It's like it's making it part of your approach to life. And then the last one, and this is really an important one, I think, is having a network of honest and supportive relationships. And I'll say more about what I mean by that. I mean, remember that I said earlier, isolation is a huge problem. And of course, the pandemic has exacerbated that in ways that are obvious. But the antidote to isolation, or one of the antidotes certainly to isolation, is to have honest and supportive relationships, to have people in your life when you're having a bad moment, when you're having a crisis, when you're struggling, that there's someone you can talk to, and there's someone you can be vulnerable with, and there's someone you can not have to be have it together and have everything figured out. So how do you do that? So number one, if it's going to be a genuinely supportive relationship, reciprocity is important. There has to be a sense that both people benefit from the relationship. It doesn't mean that you talk exactly the same number of minutes or you speak the same number of words. I mean, people have different temperaments in that respect, but it has to do with the emotional presence that people bring to the relationship, that both people care about it, both people take it seriously. It's important to both people that there be candor, and that there be closeness, and that there be clarity. And that's something that develops over time. But I think in a healthy and genuinely supportive relationship, there's reciprocity. Boundaries. So, I mean, that comes up a lot, certainly in the juvenile justice field. And we hear about boundaries from psychologists. And it's important to observe appropriate boundaries in any relationship. People are individual, and they can be very close and very supportive, but they're also autonomous. And so this whole process of figuring out how to respect each other's independence and each other's autonomy, and at the same time really be there for each other, that's a very subtle process. It takes a long time, but I think any relationship that's genuinely supportive has appropriate boundaries. Kindness, I mean, it speaks for itself, but in sort of another variant of compassion, it's just being able to see another person through a lens of they're doing the best they can. They're not perfect. They make mistakes. Sometimes they even are aggravating, but they're doing the best they can. That's you see that effort, and you see them through that lens. Obviously, respect. I don't think I need to define that. Candor is a huge one, and it goes back to one of the things that judges struggle with, because it's very hard to find people who will be candid with you. There's all the stereotypes of people laugh at your jokes even though they're not funny, and people praise your intellect even though they think you're not very smart. And there's just all of these kinds of ways that the judges do not get honest and accurate feedback. And so a good friend, a genuinely supportive relationship is one that's candid. And it doesn't just mean somebody telling you bad news. Sometimes it's somebody telling you good news, that you did that really well. I mean, you really were there for that person. You really got into that case with an incredible amount of insight. And that we need both We need candor across the board. And just to be clear, if the people involved in a relationship are not peers, then the ability to do any of these things becomes more complicated. Doesn't mean it's impossible. I mean, it doesn't mean you can't have a genuinely supportive and close relationship with somebody who's in a different position on the power pyramid than you are, but it's a factor, and it's one that I think sometimes gets undervalued. That you could have very supportive support staff, and they are doing that because they respect you and they admire you and they want to support you, and there's something really good there. But it's a little bit perilous to ignore the power imbalances in the relationship, and sometimes that can lead to problems. So here's a framework which I think probably many of you have seen before, but it's one that I find very helpful in thinking about coping. And this is the System 1, System 2 framework that Daniel Kahneman develops in his book, Thinking Fast and Slow. I always like to mention that Daniel Kahneman, he's a Nobel laureate in economics, and he never studied economics. It's one of the great fun facts that he's a psychologist, and he's never spent 1 minute in a classroom studying economics, and he won the Nobel Prize in economics because what he did do is he did some pioneering research about how people make decisions. And of course, that's very important in economics. And he sort of talks about decision making in the context of a couple of systems. So System 1 is this intuitive, reactive, spontaneous system. That's where we live most of the time. It's kind of how you go through life without really thinking about it. It's the way you intuitively, instinctively react to things. And, we get to be that way, through the accumulation of thousands of discrete incidents over the course of our life. And we adapt to a way of thinking that works for us. So there's nothing really wrong with System 1. The problem is that it's not edited. So it's going to reflect your life experience, your upbringing, your cultural constructs, your implicit assumptions, things that trigger you. All of that's in System 1. So you can go through life and not really be aware of certain things if that's the only place that you spend your time. So Kahneman also talks about System 2, which is a more reflective type of thinking, and it's one that judges are trained to do, where you're trying to figure out what the evidence is and what the law is that's applicable to that, and then you make a decision that's based on legal reasoning and logic and reflection. It actually, the line can get a little blurry because when you're making a decision based on facts, the whole question of what do you think the facts are is affected by your System 1 processes, how you see a particular fact, the salience you give to that fact, the valence you give to that fact can be affected by your stereotypes and your assumptions and your implicit biases. So it's not as clean a line as you would want it to be, but basically the process that's going on in System 2 is you're trying to reason, you're trying to be intentional rather than reactive. And I think that's the key distinction, that you're trying to think about what you're doing rather than just reacting to something. If you're doing a job that has a lot of stress, it's something like judging, where you're being exposed to a lot of emotionally laden situations. It's hard to be in System 2 sometimes because you're being triggered by what you're seeing. And that's where things like meditation and other types of capacity building can actually give you more space. In fact, one of the more popular meditation apps is called Headspace, and it really is just simply a matter of creating more space in your consciousness, so that when something does happen that sets off an emotional response, you have time to think about how you're going to respond to that, rather than just reacting to it. And things like meditation and other attention building practices help you gain more headspace or more bandwidth, so you can handle those things. But I find the system 1 and 2 construct very helpful when you think about how to cope with stress, because if you're constantly stressed, you're going to be spending most of your time in system 1, and what you want to be doing is building up your system 2 capacity, so that you can be intentional rather than reactive as you go through life. So this leads to mindfulness, which is, again, Judge Reyes and others in your conference have been talking about. Such a powerful tool for judges. I wrote a short article that's in your materials about this back in 2016, and I wrote it with a great deal of trepidation. I was the head of the Federal Judicial Center then. It's a national job. My boss was Chief Justice, and I'm from Northern California, so I immediately thought, well, I'm going to write something about mindfulness, and everybody's going to say, there's that guy from Northern California, talking about all this new agey stuff. But I really thought that it was important to talk about how developing mindfulness, which is really that additional space, that additional bandwidth, is something that is particularly useful for judges. It's not just a practice that's a good thing to do, if you want to have a happy life, but there's a way that it actually helps judges judge better, that it makes the job of the performance that people have in the judicial role better. And so that's what I tried to address in this little pamphlet. And I was really curious what the reaction would be, and I was really surprised that I was getting emails from people all over the country, not in the places I would have expected. I mean, they were in the middle of the country. They were in red states as well as blue states. It was just people saying, yeah, there's something here. There's something about giving yourself more space to make intentional decisions that is really applicable to the job that judges do. So the simple definition of mindfulness is that you're in the present rather than in the past or the future. So it just means that your attention is focused on the immediate situation in which you are, and you're not thinking about what you're going to have for dinner. You're not thinking about what you had to deal with this morning before you came to work. You're focused on the immediate situation that you're in. And it allows you to limit system 1. And I always want to stress, it's not that you're not triggered. It's not that you don't react to things. It's not that you don't have intuitive or instinctive responses to certain things, but you're creating more and more. The more you practice mindfulness, the more you're creating space for you to be in each moment as a unique moment. I give an example for judges who do criminal, and I don't know how many of you have done that as part of your judicial careers, but one of the things you hear from judges who do criminal cases is that one of the things they really dislike is taking guilty pleas, because it becomes a very routine thing. I mean, you've taken 100 guilty pleas or 1,000 guilty pleas, and you've gone through the same recitation each time. So it can become kind of an automatic thing, and you can do it without really being present. It becomes almost like a habitual thing. And of course, that may work for you, and you may look okay on a written record, but in terms of what's happening in the courtroom, the defendant is certainly not experiencing a judge who's present and engaged and interested in any kind of procedural justice. And so one of the things that mindfulness practice can do is it allows you to remember that each guilty plea is unique. Each situation that you're in is a unique situation, and bring as much of your presence and as much of your attention to that as you can. It also creates space for dealing with difficult conversations and situations. So, if somebody says something or does something that's upsetting to you, and you need to deal with it, and this could be in your professional life, or it could be in your personal life, having even a half second before you respond, to just say, okay, that thing that just happened triggered me, or that thing that just happened is causing me to have an emotional response. And then taking a few more seconds to think about what do I need to do here? It's that extra space that it creates. And you can see how in a judicial situation that's extremely valuable. So it really comes down to choosing your response. It's choosing how you're going to act in a given situation, and bringing as much of your intentionality to it as you can. And that can include things like expressing empathy, which I don't think is a dirty word for judges at all. And it's particularly if it's within the appropriateness of the role, if it's not meant to override what your legal obligation is, but it's simply a way of conveying to somebody that you can tell that they're in pain. Being compassionate, and being compassionate to yourself and others. These are things you can choose to do as you practice mindfulness. So, pro-survival attributes of judges. What helps judges survive and be well? Patience, self-explanatory. Perspective and self-awareness. Very, very helpful. Very much something that I think has evolved over time. I remember starting in judicial education more than 30 years ago, and if you use those words, half the people in the room would just cross their arms and laugh at you. What's that have to do with judging? Well, that's really not true anymore, and has a lot to do with judging, and it certainly has a lot to do with people who judge in the space where you're talking about families and children and people who are vulnerable. That being able to see yourself and see where your particular biases and limitations are is extraordinarily important. And judges who can do that seem to do better. We already talked about compassion. This is another thing you can do in terms of practices, that just taking time every day to be compassionate toward yourself or toward someone else. And connection to others, not being isolated to the extent that you can avoid it. These are things that help judges survive. So the last slide, and then we'll have some questions. You know, people always talk about humility and how humility is one of the things that's hardest for judges because of the way things are set up, you know, in the whole structure of the courtroom, although it's less the case in a lot of family courts. It's more egalitarian, but there's still a lot of hierarchy in the way our judiciary is constructed. And so it's hard to be humble when people are telling you how great you are and how smart you are. It's hard to be humble when you're the only one wearing a robe. You're the one who's being put on a pedestal, literally. So one of the things to remember is this is really hard work. So the fact that it's hard for you is not the least bit surprising. It's hard for everybody. It's just hard work. It's just the nature of the work. And you think about judges back through time. We've had judges for as long as we've had organized societies. I mean, sometimes they're called judges, sometimes they're called elders, and sometimes they have other roles in different cultures, but there's somebody who does this, sort of is the wise problem solver in every culture I know of. And you try to find people for these roles who have the wisdom and the presence to do them. It's hard work. You can't fix everything. Boy, I sure remember from my years as a family law judge, I wanted to fix everything. You know, I would just see people coming in and you know, they were having a hard time thinking straight, and they were, you know, rehearsing their conflicts with each other, and a lot of times they were using their kids as chess pieces and doing that without even realizing that that's what they were doing. And boy, did I want to fix it, because what I was seeing was a lot of pain and a lot of hurt going on, and I wanted to fix it. And you know, sometimes you can make a contribution, but a lot of times you can't, and you can't fix everything. What you can do is give people the benefit of your best judgment and your best presence and your best emotional awareness, but it's their life and it's in some ways their decision to make, and you can't fix it. So one of the paradoxes is that people who are particularly compassionate and kind and caring often are the ones who want to fix everything. And it's just sort of remembering that you can't. Again, as a recovering perfectionist, I know this to be true, that you will disappoint yourself all the time. And it comes with the territory, and it's okay. It's okay that you disappoint yourself. And this is the good part, right? I mean, you will have many opportunities to practice and learn. So each day presents new opportunities to learn from what you did before, and it's always a work in progress. And I think one of my mantras certainly is like, I'm going to do the best I can every day, and I'm going to fall woefully short of what I hope I could do in my most ideal self, but that's okay. That it's just absolutely fine. Okay, it's time for questions.
Judge Vogel, I thank you so much. And as we were watching and listening to you, my colleague from Wisconsin, Judge Gaylord, retired now, luckily for her, and unlucky for us because we miss her. She brings up an interesting point. As we continue to work through this COVID stress, these stressors that you've been talking about really apply generally to the public as well. So she started thinking about witnesses and jurors and attorneys. And as we get put pressure on us to get back to, so to speak, normal, people want to get back to jury trials. And we'd like to hear your perspective on what this does and what kind of considerations we should have. Because of course we want to fix everything, right?
Right.
We can't necessarily fix it for the jurors.
Yeah, I think it's a tough one because, jury trials are a fundamental part of our system. I think the judges I know would like to see jury trials resume. Actually, I've heard that some people would like to do jury service just because it would make their lives more varied, right? I mean, they could get out of the house, right? And they could do something different. I think what has to be done to make that happen is you really have to pay attention to taking care to do it the right way, not rushing into it, not saying, oh my God, we got to do it. We got all these backlog cases, and you have to really, get some good consultation with people who know what they're doing, public health people, so that the way you set up your courtrooms is smart, so that people's health is protected, so that you think about the confrontation aspects of things as well. That I know in criminal cases there's concern about being able to see people's faces when they're testifying, and the problem with masks. And I mean, there's so many details that have to be thought about. And I guess that's my answer to your question: is it's you have to take the time to really think it through in a very granular way. And I think it's worth doing. I think it's important that we bring jury trials back. I think it's an important part of our system. But I think doing it, you can't rush into it. You can't just do it for the sake of doing it.
And I think that when we talk about mindfulness, you were so precise and perfect on that. When we're mindful for ourselves, we also give space for others to be mindful as well.
Well, that's really the thing about it, is that it's not one way. I mean,
Right.
as you develop the space, it's really interesting, because you not only have more intentionality with regard to your own responses, but you're able to see other people better, and you're able to see if somebody's acting in a way that is not a good way. I mean, it gives you some pause to think about, well, why are they doing that? What might be going on here that is causing the person to behave that way, and which is not the same thing as giving people a pass. I mean, people can behave badly, and things need to happen if they do, but it's just asking yourself and it's not even, I mean, I know for me it's more like I see somebody acting out. And I say, oh, they're acting out. I wonder what's going on for them right now. I wonder why that's happening. So it's that moment of pause there.
I wonder if everyone could use their reactions and just raise your hands if you remember self-care on a daily basis. Anybody? Self-care on a daily basis? How about a weekly basis? Okay, that's good. How about a monthly basis? We got more hands. I mean, I think consistency, Judge Fogel, can you speak to just how much of a dose of self-care we need?
Oh gosh, thank you. That's such a good question, right? So I have a couple of thoughts. One is that when I do some teaching just on mindfulness, and when I do that, sometimes people, I can't take 20 minutes every day to meditate. I don't have time. I've got too many cases. I got too much else going on in my life. So there's that sense of people feeling like they don't have time, which actually is not really true. I mean, it feels like that, but probably in the majority of cases, it's not true. But the feeling is real. So that's just something to know. For me personally, one of the things that the pandemic did for me, which I totally did not see coming, is it's given me a lot more space for self-care. I have for many years, ever since I went to the Federal Judicial Center, I've had a very heavy travel schedule. I would go all over the country, and I've been doing that at Berkeley as well. And I couldn't travel anymore. I haven't been anywhere since last March. And so I have all this extra time at home. And so my exercise routine got much more stable, and my meditation routine got much more stable. I mean, when I'm on the road, maybe I'll meditate, maybe I won't. So if it was a good week, I might meditate 2 or 3 times. Now I do it every day, and I began to notice almost immediately the difference that the daily practice made. That it was just a matter of, oh, okay, so this is, it's not that it doesn't help to do it a couple times a week, but the daily iteration made an enormous difference. And then my wife and my kids, who never are afraid to tell me if I'm messing up, speaking about honest feedback, they were saying, Dad, you're different, and my wife appreciates that I'm not as defensive as I usually am, and it's like, and it's just things like that I think the more you can routinize your self-care, the better. I mean, I think it really does pay off, and it feels like you don't have time, but actually it's just a matter of thinking through your day.
Well, I shared in the chat that my NCJ FCJ family keeps me grounded. But in addition to that, we have a commitment to wellness for this organization. Jen Donovan and her cohorts have done a great job with our Monday morning wellness for members, and it's been a heaven sent for many of us. And this conference has been sort of sprinkled with little things to help us take care of ourselves as well. We're at the 24 after. So if we didn't get into any of your questions, you can certainly send them to us and we'll pass them on to Judge Fogel. Thank you so much, Judge Fogel. This has been a lovely, lovely way to spend this time for us to just be reminded that we are perfectionists in recovery, right?
Right.
And we can't be
one day at a time.
One day at a time. That's right. And being members of the NCJ FCJ has been, and for those of you who want to join us and continue in your membership, it really has become a family. And it helps us to stay grounded, because sometimes you can't walk down the hall to talk to your colleague, especially during this time of COVID. But I reach across the country and talk to my friend Gail Carr or other members of my NCJ family. Poor Ernestine has heard more from me and make sure that I stay grounded as well. So we thank you for this time. We thank you very much for this inspiring and very timely presentation.
Well, thanks. Thank you so much for having me. It was really a
It's been
treat.
a pleasure.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We are all very, very grateful for all of our sponsors. And I would like to just remind everybody to utilize your conference app to access the conference schedule, because you'll find Judge Fogel's speaker bio in there, and rate this session and the other sessions that you have attended. If you need your certificate of attendance for CEU and CLE purposes, those will be mailed to you in the conference tote bag, which is available on the conference app as well. By signing into the Zoom session, you're logged into the session, so you don't need, if you need that as proof of attendance, please do not hesitate to contact us. We have those records. And if you're like me, that sometimes get bounced off and come back on, don't worry, we got you covered. We still have you. And another big, big thank you to the conference sponsors. Please take the time to visit with them in the sponsor gallery. A special thanks to our sponsors, USTL, Soberlink, Pegasus Schools, our exhibitors, Casebook, Boys Town, Equivant, and our programs. My Murphy robe, I wore it this morning for a hearing while I was in this conference. So the Office of Juvenile Delinquency and Prevention, and the University of Nevada, Reno Justice Management degree program. Mark your calendars, because hopefully we people like me will get to hug come July in St. Louis, July 18th through July 21st. Judge Fogel, we are family, and CJFCJ is family. You are family. If you can join us and hang in there with us in July, that would be great too. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks very much. Bye, everybody.